Did FBI Director Kash Patel just fire the very agents who investigated him? Watch how Representative Jamie Raskin used just 3 ordinary pieces of paper and 18 seconds of deafening silence to spring an inescapable trap. 3 documents. That is what Jamie Raskin carried into the House Judiciary Committee hearing room when it was his turn to question FBI Director Kash Patel. Not a massive stack of classified binders, not a dramatic, oversized exhibit board designed for television cameras, and not the kind of thick investigative file that signals a long, drawn-out procedural battle ahead. Just 3 documents, each one printed on ordinary paper, each one already publicly known, and each one highly capable, when placed in the correct sequential order, of reducing 17 months of Kash Patel's public justifications for purging his own bureau into a single, unavoidable conclusion. The first document was a Reuters report published on February 25, 2026. The second was Kash Patel's own public statement, responding to that very report. The statement where he passionately described the FBI's subpoena of his phone records as outrageous and deeply alarming. And the third document was a set of termination notices. These notices were issued within 24 hours of that public statement, affecting more than a dozen FBI agents, analysts, and support staff who had worked on the federal investigation connected to those exact same phone records. 3 documents, 1 timeline, 1 singular question. If you understand the relationship between those 3 pieces of paper, you understand why what happened in the next 7 minutes inside that hearing room is already being called the most damaging congressional exchange of Kash Patel's tenure as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because this was not simply a polite disagreement over investigative methods. It was not a standard partisan argument about the conduct of a previous political administration, nor was it a routine oversight exchange where a lawmaker criticizes an agency decision and the agency head offers a carefully worded, bureaucratic defense. What happened here was something else entirely. This was the exact moment when a member of Congress placed 3 publicly documented facts next to each other and asked the simplest possible question about the relationship between them. It was a question that Kash Patel could not answer without either admitting to retaliation or arguing that one of the most routine investigative practices in federal law enforcement is itself a massive abuse of power. Before we go any further, it is absolutely critical to understand exactly what those 3 documents represent. The power of what Raskin did in that hearing room does not come from theatrical rhetoric. It comes from the way those documents expose a glaring contradiction that had been sitting in plain sight for 11 days. Start, Reuters report. On February 25th, Reuters revealed that during the Biden administration, the FBI had subpoenaed the toll records of Kash Patel and Susie Wiles, while both were private citizens in 2022 and 2023. Now, toll records are not audio recordings. They are not written transcripts. They are not the actual content of private conversations. Toll records are simply the metadata of communication, the log of which numbers called which numbers, when those specific calls occurred, and exactly how long they lasted. For anyone who has ever worked inside federal law enforcement, that type of subpoena is not extraordinary in the slightest. It is entirely routine. Grand jury investigations obtain toll records constantly because they establish necessary patterns of communication without ever intruding into the private substance of what was actually said. They are one of the most basic, foundational investigative tools used in complex criminal investigations across the entire United States. And in this particular case, Kash Patel was not some random citizen caught up in an overly broad investigative dragnet. He had been formally summoned before a grand jury in 2022 and compelled to testify. In exchange for that testimony, he had received limited immunity from prosecution, which means he had known definitively since 2022 that he was directly connected to an active federal criminal investigation. That is the first document. The second document is Kash Patel's fiery response. Within hours of the Reuters story being published, Patel issued a sweeping statement condemning the subpoena of his phone records. In that statement, he forcefully described the actions of the previous FBI leadership as outrageous and deeply alarming. He claimed the records had been obtained using flimsy pretexts. He argued that the entire investigative process had been buried inside what he called prohibited case files, intentionally designed to evade standard oversight. It was a forceful, highly publicized statement, the kind of statement that signals outrage not only at a specific investigative step, but at the fundamental legitimacy of the investigation itself. And for 11 days, that statement formed the dominant public narrative surrounding the story. According to Patel, what had happened to him was not routine investigative procedure, it was a targeted abuse of power. But then comes the third document. Within 24 hours of issuing that statement, the FBI abruptly began firing people. By February 26th, more than a dozen employees had been abruptly terminated: agents, analysts, and vital support staff who had worked on Special Counsel Jack Smith's classified documents investigation. Several of them came directly from CI-12, the highly specialized counterintelligence unit specifically responsible for tracking Iranian operations on American soil. These were not standard disciplinary removals following a long, exhaustive internal investigation. There were no public findings of misconduct. There were no completed administrative reviews concluding that these career employees had violated FBI policy or broken federal law. They were fired on the exact same day Kash Patel learned that his own phone records had been subpoenaed as part of that earlier investigation. The FBI Agents Association, the professional organization proudly representing thousands of bureau personnel, immediately issued a statement condemning the decision. They didn't use partisan language or the rhetoric of political advocacy. They used the grave language of institutional alarm. These actions weakened the Bureau by stripping away critical expertise and destabilizing the workforce, the association wrote, ultimately putting the nation at greater risk. That is the third document. When you place those three documents in chronological order, the Reuters report, Patel's statement, and the FBI terminations, the timeline raises a question that simply cannot be ignored. If obtaining Kash Patel's phone records during a legitimate federal investigation was truly outrageous and deeply alarming, what does it mean that the director of the FBI fired the very agents who obtained those records the exact moment he learned about them? That is the heavy question Jamie Raskin carried with him into the hearing room. By the time Raskin's turn arrived, the hearing had already been underway for more than 90 minutes. Kash Patel had looked incredibly composed, confident, and almost relaxed in the witness chair. His answers possessed the smooth cadence of someone who had rehearsed his preferred narrative many times before. He repeatedly described the earlier investigation as abusive. He intentionally repeated the phrase prohibited case files several times. He carefully framed the Reuters report as clear evidence of misconduct by previous FBI leadership, and for a while, the strategy worked. Because congressional hearings often operate according to highly predictable rhythms, members ask broad, sweeping questions. Witnesses respond with carefully constructed, pre-planned explanations. Time expires. The next member begins. But Raskin did something radically different. He did not begin with a grandstanding speech. He did not immediately accuse Patel of corruption or blatant retaliation. He simply opened the unassuming folder containing those three documents and said a single sentence that instantly shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. Director Patel, I want to talk about toll records. At that exact moment, the conversation moved swiftly away from public narrative and directly into hard evidence. Raskin held up the second document, first the statement Patel had proudly issued on February 25th. "I'm going to read a portion of your statement," he said calmly. Then, he read the line aloud for the entire room to hear. "It is outrageous and deeply alarming that the previous FBI leadership secretly subpoenaed my own phone records, along with those of now White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, using flimsy pretexts and burying the entire process in prohibited case files designed to evade oversight." Raskin deliberately lowered the page and looked directly at Patel. "Is that an accurate quotation of your statement?" Patel nodded. "Yes, Congressman." Raskin then smoothly picked up the third document, the termination records. Within 24 hours of issuing that statement, Raskin continued, "More than a dozen FBI employees were terminated. Many of them worked on Special Counsel Jack Smith's classified documents investigation. Is that accurate?" Patel shifted slightly, visibly uncomfortable in his chair. "Personnel decisions were made following a review of the circumstances," he replied carefully. Raskin just nodded. "A review completed within 24 hours. He did not phrase it as a question. He simply let the remarkably brief timeline sit in the heavy air between them, because the timeline is the definitive key to everything that follows. Once those three documents are placed firmly on the congressional record in that exact order, the rest of the hearing completely stops being about abstract policy disagreements. It becomes entirely about causation. Did the firings occur because of actual misconduct? Or did they occur strictly because Kash Patel discovered that his own phone records had been subpoenaed during a legitimate federal investigation? That is the critical question that will define absolutely everything that happens next in this hearing. Because, in the next few tense minutes, Jamie Raskin is going to do something that congressional investigators rarely ever manage to do so cleanly. He is going to forcefully back the director of the FBI into a rigid, logical position where every single available answer carries severe consequences and where the absence of a clear answer becomes its own damning kind of evidence. And when that pivotal moment finally arrives, the entire room will fall completely silent for 18 seconds. 18 seconds that will reveal more about the true reason behind those firings than 17 months of public statements ever possibly could. But the silence did not come immediately. First came the necessary clarification. Before Jamie Raskin asked the question that would freeze the room, he did something that experienced prosecutors understand instinctively. He deliberately removed the ambiguity that cornered witnesses often try to hide behind. If there is a misunderstanding in the facts, correct it immediately. If there is confusion about the law, clarify it clearly. Strip away every possible rhetorical escape route until only the raw truth or a glaring contradiction remains. So, Raskin picked up the third document in his folder and held it delicately between two fingers, as if it weighed absolutely nothing. "Director Patel," he said calmly, "before we go further, I want to make sure the public understands what toll records actually are." That sentence mattered immensely because, for 11 straight days, the public conversation around this entire story had been manipulated by Kash Patel's own framing. The dramatic phrase, "my phone records were secretly subpoenaed," carries a heavy emotional weight when regular people hear it outside the highly technical context of federal criminal investigations. It sounds deeply invasive. It sounds uncomfortably personal. It sounds exactly like someone was listening in on private, intimate conversations. But toll records are absolutely not that. They are purely the metadata of communication. Which numbers contacted which numbers, at what specific time, and for exactly how long. No content, no audio recordings, no written transcripts. And under federal law, a grand jury subpoena for toll records does not even require judicial approval from a judge, because it is universally considered a standard, routine investigative step. When determining patterns of contact between individuals connected to a criminal investigation, Raskin knew that. The seasoned attorneys in the room knew that. Every experienced federal investigator watching that hearing on television knew that. But millions of citizens following the story strictly through sensational headlines and social media commentary did not necessarily understand the critical difference. So he said it out loud for the record. Toll records, Raskin continued, are the timing and recipients of calls. They are not the content of conversations. They are not recordings. They are not transcripts. He paused just long enough for the factual explanation to settle. And federal law enforcement agencies obtain toll records through grand jury subpoenas every single day in criminal investigations across this country. Then, he looked piercingly back at Patel. You were summoned before that grand jury in 2022 and provided testimony under limited immunity, which means you knew at the time that you were connected to an active federal investigation. Patel nodded slightly but chose not to interrupt. That small, silent nod mattered immensely, because every factual acknowledgement Raskin secured steadily narrowed the stable ground beneath Patel's defense. Raskin then leaned forward slightly over the heavy witness table and asked the very first question that began to tighten the trap. Is it your position that the agents who subpoenaed your toll records during that investigation acted improperly? The phrasing was incredibly deliberate. He did not ask whether Patel merely believed the investigation was politically motivated. He did not ask whether Patel felt the subpoena was personally unfair. He asked point-blank whether the agents acted improperly. In other words, did the agents actually break the established rules, or did they simply use a perfectly legal investigative tool that Patel just did not like being applied to him? Patel shifted uncomfortably in his chair again before answering. The records were obtained through processes that, in my assessment, went beyond what was appropriate for the investigation, he said. Notice the careful structure of that answer. In my assessment, not in violation of federal law, not contrary to stated FBI policy, not based on documented findings from an official internal review, just Kash Patel's own personal judgment about what he felt was appropriate. And that subtle distinction is exactly where the entire hearing begins to move into what seasoned prosecutors call evidentiary stacking. Because once the core argument becomes my assessment, the next logical question becomes glaringly obvious. If the agents broke rules, show the committee the rules they broke. If the agents committed actual misconduct, show the official misconduct finding. If the agents violated established policy, show the documented policy violation. But absolutely none of those documents existed in the folder Raskin brought with him. Instead, he picked up the first document again, the Reuters report, and tapped it lightly against the wooden table. This investigation, Raskin said, was part of Special Counsel Jack Smith's review of classified documents connected to the former president. You were a witness connected to that investigation. Patel did not attempt to dispute that fact. So let me ask you something directly, Raskin continued. When federal investigators subpoena the call records of individuals connected to a subject in an investigation, is that unusual? Patel hesitated. The hesitation itself loudly told the entire room what the answer had to be. No, he said finally. It was the very first crack in his armor. Because if subpoenaing toll records of individuals tangentially connected to an investigation is not unusual, then the act of subpoenaing Patel's records cannot, by itself, be proof of any misconduct. And if the subpoena was not proof of misconduct, then abruptly firing the agents who executed it requires a completely different explanation. Raskin knew the crucial next step had to actively push that contradiction out into the open. So, he began relentlessly listing historical examples. During the investigation of Paul Manafort, the FBI subpoenaed call records. During the investigation of Michael Cohen, the FBI subpoenaed call records. In organized crime investigations, terrorism investigations, corruption investigations, federal agents routinely subpoena call logs to establish vital patterns of contact. He paused, looking directly at Patel once again. Were those subpoenas outrageous? Patel did not answer immediately, because answering yes would broadly imply that decades of standard federal investigative practice are somehow illegitimate. But answering no would completely collapse the fragile logic of his own public statement. And that is exactly what makes the next moment in the hearing so utterly devastating from a legal perspective. Because Raskin did not let the awkward silence stretch on indefinitely. Instead, he read Patel's own dramatic words back to him again. "It is outrageous and deeply alarming," Raskin repeated slowly, placing the paper deliberately back on the table. "You described the subpoena of your phone records using those exact words." Then he asked the sentence that would permanently define the exchange. If subpoenaing call logs in federal investigations is routine practice, why was it outrageous when investigators subpoenaed yours? Patel inhaled slowly, visibly calculating before responding. The specific circumstances surrounding how those records were obtained raised concerns about oversight mechanisms that were bypassed, he said. Again, the language was incredibly careful. Concerns, circumstances, oversight mechanisms. But still, conspicuously, no mention of an actual, definable rule violation. And still, no concrete evidence of misconduct. That is precisely when Raskin introduced the powerful document that permanently changed the moral gravity of the conversation. The stark statement from the FBI Agents Association. He held the printed page up high, just long enough for the news cameras to clearly capture the official heading, before reading a single, devastating line aloud. These actions weaken the Bureau by stripping away critical expertise and destabilizing the workforce, ultimately putting the nation at greater risk. Then, he lowered the page and addressed Patel with profound directness. That statement was issued by the professional association representing FBI agents, Raskin said. The agents you fired. It was a brilliant, subtle shift in tone. Until that precise moment, the discussion had been highly procedural. Investigative tools, subpoenas, oversight protocols. But now, the devastating human cost officially entered the record. These were not faceless, anonymous bureaucratic positions passively eliminated in a routine budget restructuring. These were real people, dedicated career investigators who had spent long years working incredibly complex counterintelligence operations, including high-stakes efforts to track dangerous Iranian activity on American soil. These were people holding vast institutional knowledge that simply cannot be replaced overnight. And they were entirely gone within 24 short hours of Kash Patel learning that they had lawfully subpoenaed his phone records. That is the profound moral contrast sitting at the very center of this story. On one side, a vastly powerful official describing an entirely routine investigative step affecting him personally as outrageous. On the other side, the respected professional organization representing the agents who executed that step, urgently warning that firing them fundamentally weakens the institution responsible for protecting the entire country. Raskin allowed that heavy contrast to physically hang in the room before he calmly asked the question that brought everything to its absolute breaking point. "Director Patel," he said quietly, "I have one final question." The room had become noticeably, uncomfortably still. Even committee members who had been distractedly shuffling papers earlier were now completely locked in, closely watching the exchange. Because the question that follows is the exact kind that forcefully backs a witness into a corner, forcing them to choose between two irreconcilable realities. Either the firings were thoroughly justified by documented misconduct, or they definitively were not. Raskin leaned forward slightly, "I want a yes or no answer," he said firmly. "Did any of the agents you fired receive a formal finding of misconduct, an administrative review conclusion, or any determination that they violated FBI policy before you terminated them?" And that is the exact moment when the massive hearing room went completely silent. This was not the polite, respectful silence that typically accompanies routine testimony. This was the heavy, suffocating kind of silence that happens when absolutely everyone present inherently understands that the very next word spoken will permanently define the entire controversy. Patel looked down at the table directly in front of him. His hands were pressed flat against the wood surface. Behind him, his lead attorney leaned forward slightly, as if frantically calculating whether an intervention would help or only make the dire situation exponentially worse. 18 seconds passed. In casual, everyday conversation, 18 seconds is almost nothing. In a high-stakes congressional hearing, it is a painful eternity. It is more than long enough for every single person in the room to reach the exact same logical conclusion before the witness even opens his mouth to answer. Because when a simple yes or no question is met with 18 seconds of agonizing silence, the obvious absence of the word yes already tells you everything you need to know about what the answer will be. And when Kash Patel finally spoke, he grimly confirmed it. No formal misconduct determination had been completed at the time of the personnel actions. For a moment after Kash Patel quietly spoke those words, absolutely nothing else in the hearing room seemed to move. No formal misconduct determination had been completed at the time of the personnel actions. That sentence did not sound dramatic. It was not shouted in anger. It was not even phrased as a dramatic admission of guilt. It was delivered in the flat, neutral, administrative tone of a bureaucrat describing a minor procedural detail. But inside a congressional oversight hearing, that sentence carried massive legal consequences that every seasoned lawyer in the room understood immediately. Because once the acting director of the FBI openly confirms on the record that dedicated employees were swiftly terminated without a completed finding of misconduct, the entire justification for those firings changes category completely. They are no longer legitimate disciplinary actions based on documented wrongdoing. They become subjective, discretionary actions based on personal judgment. And when that personal judgment occurs on the exact same day, the director discovers that those very employees subpoenaed his own phone records during a legal federal investigation. The appearance of retaliation instantly stops being a mere rhetorical accusation and aggressively starts looking like a sound, logical conclusion. Jamie Raskin did not triumphantly raise his voice when Patel finished speaking. He did not angrily accuse him of a massive abuse of power. He simply repeated the key phrase slowly, as if meticulously ensuring the official congressional record captured it with absolute, undeniable clarity. No formal determination. Then he quietly closed the folder containing the 3 documents he had brought with him. In most congressional hearings, that physical gesture signals the definitive end of a line of questioning. But in this profound moment, it meant something else entirely. It meant the crucial evidence had already been established beyond a shadow of a doubt. Everything that logically followed would simply explain its dire implications. Director Patel, Raskin said steadily, the agents you terminated were working on a federal investigation in which you were a known witness. That investigation used a standard grand jury subpoena to obtain your toll records, and you have just confirmed that none of those agents had been formally found to have committed misconduct before they were fired. He paused, letting the weight of the summary settle. Do I have those facts correct? Patel did not respond immediately, knowing fully well that confirming them again would only reinforce the inescapable structure Raskin had just masterfully laid out. But it didn't matter. The facts themselves were already cemented in the official record. The Reuters report firmly established the subpoena. Patel's public statement established his outrage. The termination notices established the timeline of the firings, and Patel's own spoken answer established the glaring absence of any misconduct findings. This is exactly what prosecutors mean when they talk about evidentiary stacking. Each individual piece of evidence might appear vaguely explainable on its own, but when they are meticulously placed together in a tight sequence, they form an overwhelming narrative that becomes increasingly impossible to escape. Raskin knew the devastating next step was to expose the glaring internal contradiction in Patel's public defense, because for 11 solid days, Patel had forcefully argued that the rapid firings were entirely necessary to restore integrity inside the FBI. He had described the earlier investigation as abusive. He had strongly suggested that the agents involved had acted improperly, but the answer he had just been forced to give created a massive problem for that narrative. If the agents truly committed misconduct, there should be a documented finding. If the agents violated established FBI policy, there should be an exhaustive administrative review concluding that a violation occurred. If the agents abused their investigative authority, there should be concrete evidence demonstrating that abuse. Instead, the director of the FBI had just told the United States Congress that absolutely none of those required determinations existed at the time the employees were terminated, which leaves only one single fact that perfectly coincides with the timing of those firings. The exact moment Kash Patel learned that those agents had subpoenaed his phone records, Raskin patiently let that heavy logic settle over the entire room before continuing. For the benefit of the public watching this hearing, he said, "Let me explain why that distinction matters so much." The tone of his voice shifted slightly, not louder, not theatrical, but unmistakably deliberate. In the exact way a seasoned prosecutor addresses a juror when transitioning from raw testimony to analytical conclusion. In federal law enforcement, Raskin continued, there are strict procedures governing disciplinary action against agents. Those procedures exist for a very specific reason. They ensure that personnel decisions are based on documented facts and findings, not personal grievances. He gestured lightly toward Patel. When an agent actually violates policy, an internal review occurs, evidence is closely examined, conclusions are reached, and if misconduct is firmly established, disciplinary action follows. Then he leaned forward slightly. But you have just told this committee that none of that required process had been completed when those agents were fired. Again, the silence returned. Because once that vital procedural framework is explained, the central question becomes entirely unavoidable. If there was no misconduct finding, no completed administrative review, and absolutely no documented violation of policy, what exactly justified the mass termination of more than a dozen federal employees in a single day? Raskin answered his own question by methodically returning to the timeline. February 25th, he stated, Reuters reports that your phone records were subpoenaed during an earlier investigation. He raised one finger. Within hours, you issue a highly public statement, calling that specific subpoena outrageous. Another finger went up. Within 24 hours, the specific agents connected to that investigation are summarily terminated. Then he slowly lowered his hand. That is the undeniable sequence of events established by the documents in this folder and by your own sworn testimony today. The absolute power of that summary lay in its sheer simplicity. It did not rely on wild speculation. It did not require any complex interpretation of classified, redacted information. It simply described the undeniable order in which real events occurred. And once that order is clearly understood, the explanation offered by Kash Patel becomes practically impossible to reconcile with reality. Because if the firings were truly unrelated to the subpoena of his phone records, the timing would be an extraordinary, almost impossible coincidence. If the firings were legitimately based on misconduct, the official findings documenting that misconduct would already exist. And if the firings were merely part of a broader, innocent restructuring of the Bureau, the specific employees targeted would not all share the exact same connection to a single, specific investigation involving the director himself. Raskin did not even need to explicitly accuse Patel of retaliation. The cold logic of the timeline had already introduced the undeniable possibility. Instead, Raskin gracefully shifted the focus to the broader, far more dangerous implications. "Director Patel," he said, "the FBI Agents Association issued a stark statement, warning that these firings weakened the Bureau by removing critical expertise." He tapped the document lightly. These were dedicated agents with years of hard-earned experience in counterintelligence work. Some were actively involved in tracking hostile Iranian operations targeting the United States. He looked up from the page, his expression grave. When those individuals are removed from the Bureau overnight, their specialized expertise does not instantly transfer to someone else. Deep institutional knowledge simply disappears. That was the profound moral center of the entire hearing. Not just the highly legal question of retaliation, but the severe, real-world consequences of abruptly removing experienced investigators from sensitive national security work. Because when a counterintelligence agent with a decade of specific experience tracking foreign terror networks leaves the Bureau abruptly, the loss is not merely theoretical. It is intensely operational. Active cases slow down. Vital contacts vanish. Years of accumulated, nuanced understanding about adversary behavior walk right out the building with the person who developed it. Raskin inherently understood that this point needed to be entirely visible to the public watching the hearing. So he asked the question that transformed the debate from a procedural argument into an ethical reckoning. "Director Patel," he said quietly, "do you truly believe the FBI is stronger today after firing those agents?" Patel responded with extreme caution. "The Bureau must operate with integrity," he said stiffly. "When investigative authority is abused, accountability is necessary." Again, the exact same defensive phrase appeared: investigative authority abused. But the hearing had already thoroughly established a fatal problem with that argument. If investigative authority was truly abused, where is the formal finding that proves it? Where is the comprehensive review documenting it? Where is the official determination concluding those agents violated policy? Without those necessary documents, the grave claim of abuse becomes a mere assertion rather than actual evidence. And empty assertions do not carry the same weight as documented findings inside an oversight hearing. Raskin allowed Patel's weak statement to stand alone for a moment before returning to the central, glaring contradiction one final time. "You have described the subpoena of your call records as outrageous," he said. "The agents involved in that subpoena described their own actions as routine investigative work." He gestured toward the statement from the FBI Agents Association, and their professional organization says, "Your vindictive response to that work puts the nation at greater risk." He leaned back slightly in his chair. So, the country is left with two vastly competing explanations. One explanation says the agents abused their authority. The other says the director forcefully retaliated against agents merely for doing their jobs. And the hearing record now contains the hard facts necessary for the public to decide which explanation makes far more sense. Raskin gathered the papers on the table in front of him, slowly, deliberately. Then he looked directly at Kash Patel one final time before yielding the remainder of his time. "Director," he said, "the question this committee must now consider is not whether subpoenas for toll records are routine investigative tools. They are. The question is whether the director of the FBI can summarily remove agents from their positions without any misconduct findings, simply because those agents used that standard tool in an investigation tangentially connected to him." He paused, letting the gravity sink in. Because if that is what actually happened here, this hearing is no longer about an investigative dispute. It is entirely about whether the most powerful law enforcement official in the country can punish the very people responsible for investigating him. What makes moments exactly like this incredibly dangerous for a witness in a congressional hearing is not the accusation itself. Accusations happen constantly in Washington politics. Members of Congress passionately accuse agency heads of misconduct every single week. Those specific exchanges are loud, highly partisan, and usually forgettable. What makes a moment truly dangerous is when the loud accusation is no longer necessary, because the established facts have already successfully formed the accusation on their own. By the time Jamie Raskin finished speaking, the hearing room had permanently moved past the point where Kash Patel's earlier, rehearsed narrative could simply be repeated. The dramatic words, abuse of authority, and outrageous investigative conduct no longer floated freely in the air as viable talking points. They had been forcefully pinned down right next to an indisputable timeline, next to real documents, and next to Patel's own sworn testimony confirming that the employees he fired had absolutely not been formally found guilty of misconduct before losing their livelihoods. That is exactly why the silence following Raskin's final question felt vastly different from the normal, quiet pauses of congressional hearings. It was the heavy silence that follows the closing of an airtight argument, when absolutely everyone in the room understands that the damning evidence has already been fully entered into the record. Kash Patel eventually resumed speaking much later in the hearing. Other committee members asked varied questions about entirely unrelated topics. The cadence of the long session slowly, inevitably returned to the familiar, expected rhythm of oversight. 5 minutes for each member, a standard mix of supportive partisan statements and critical inquiries, the occasional interruption for minor procedural clarification. But the essential, immovable structure of the story had already been permanently locked in place. 3 documents, 1 timeline, and 1 devastating answer that Kash Patel simply could not avoid giving. No formal misconduct determination had been completed at the time the agents were fired. Those specific words matter tremendously, because federal law enforcement institutions fundamentally operate on the core premise that immense authority must be strictly separated from personal interest. An FBI director holds enormous, sweeping power over the careers of thousands of dedicated employees, over the direction of crucial investigations, and over the vast resources devoted to active national security threats. That power is tolerated by a democratic society only because it is firmly constrained by established procedure, internal reviews, documented findings, and independent oversight. Without those necessary guardrails, personnel decisions rapidly stop looking like institutional discipline and abruptly start looking like personal, vindictive retaliation. That is the moral line Raskin was drawing inside that hearing room. Not a simple partisan line between Democrats and Republicans, but a fundamental structural line between the rule of law and the terrifying possibility that law enforcement authority could be bent strictly toward protecting the powerful from any scrutiny. Because consider the impossible position the public is now being asked to blindly accept. Kash Patel argues that the legal subpoena of his phone records during a federal investigation was somehow outrageous. Yet, that exact same investigative step subpoenaing call logs is a perfectly standard practice used in thousands of vital federal cases every single year. If Patel is truly correct that the act was inherently abusive, then the FBI's entire normal investigative procedures would themselves be highly suspect. Every single case that ever relied on similar subpoenas could be thrown into question. But if the subpoena was routine, if it perfectly followed the normal logic of a grand jury investigation, then the only genuinely unusual event in this entire timeline is the sudden, mass termination of the agents who obtained those records the moment Patel became director of the Bureau. That is the glaring contradiction that sits at the very center of this entire escalating controversy. And it is not merely some abstract academic debate about obscure investigative technique. It is a fundamental question about exactly how power behaves when it forcefully collides with accountability. Because the dedicated agents involved in that earlier investigation were absolutely not celebrities. Their names were not widely known to the general public. They were career investigators whose critical work normally takes place far out of sight from bright television cameras and loud congressional microphones. The specialized counterintelligence specialists tracking Iranian operations on American soil are not political actors. They are vital technicians of national security, people who spend grueling years building niche expertise that simply cannot easily be replaced. When those individuals lose their hard-earned positions overnight, the loss is not only deeply personal to them, it is devastatingly institutional. Years of crucial operational knowledge vanish with them into the wind. Delicate networks of contacts developed over long, dangerous investigations dissolve entirely. Important cases that relied on those specific investigators drastically slow down or disappear entirely. That is exactly why the FBI Agents Association deliberately used the grave language it did in its public statement condemning the firings. Not partisan political outrage, but deep institutional alarm. Weakening the Bureau, stripping away expertise, putting the entire nation at greater risk. Those are absolutely not phrases chosen lightly by serious professionals whose entire careers are built around protecting the immense credibility of the organization they serve. Which brings us right back to the pivotal moment that defined the entire hearing. 18 seconds of silence before Kash Patel confirmed that no formal misconduct findings existed when those agents were abruptly terminated. 18 seconds may not sound overly dramatic, but in the nuanced language of congressional oversight, silence often speaks far louder than speech, because a witness facing a direct yes or no question from a ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee inherently understands exactly what is at stake in that answer. The response instantly becomes part of the permanent congressional record. It heavily shapes how future courts, inspectors general, and investigators interpret the pivotal events being discussed. And once that answer firmly exists on the record, it cannot easily be erased or walked back. That is why the exchange is already rapidly circulating across political media and legal commentary circles, not because it contained theatrical shouting or wild spectacle, but strictly because it established a solid factual framework that future legal challenges will inevitably build upon. The FBI Agents Association has already officially filed a separate legal challenge to the firings. In the tense weeks ahead, lawyers aggressively representing the terminated employees will likely argue that the actions directly violated established procedures governing personnel discipline inside the Bureau. They will vigorously point to the glaring absence of any misconduct findings. They will point straight to the damning timeline connecting the firings to the sudden discovery of Patel's subpoenaed phone records. And they will definitively point to the sworn testimony given in that exact hearing room, where the director himself confirmed that those required findings simply did not exist when the personnel decisions were made. Whether those legal challenges ultimately succeed will depend entirely on facts and arguments that unfold in courtrooms rather than congressional chambers. But the lasting significance of the hearing lies entirely in the incredible way it forced those critical facts out into the open. Before that masterful exchange, the massive controversy surrounding the firings could easily be framed as a mere dispute over investigative conduct. After that exchange, the question looks fundamentally different. It becomes a massive question about whether the director of the FBI forcefully punished employees who carried out a perfectly lawful investigative step simply because that step affected him personally. That is not a partisan question. It is a profound structural question about the integrity of the institutions that hold immense investigative power. Because if the people directly responsible for enforcing the law can easily remove investigators merely for investigating them, the entire logic of independent law enforcement begins to rapidly collapse. Imagine the terrifying precedent such a practice would permanently create. Every future investigator would clearly understand that pursuing valid evidence involving powerful officials carries a severe professional risk. Routine subpoenas could suddenly become career hazards rather than standard investigative tools. And once dedicated investigators begin calculating their own personal safety before following the evidence, the public's vital trust in the impartial application of law begins to severely erode. That is exactly why moments like this hearing matter far beyond the specific personalities involved. Jamie Raskin and Kash Patel will both leave public office eventually. Political administrations will inevitably change. But the institutional norms governing exactly how law enforcement power is used or misused will remain forever. So, the massive question that lingers heavily after this exchange is not simply whether the specific firings were justified. The much deeper question is whether the vital rules designed to protect investigative independence still actually function when the person being investigated suddenly gains control of the very institution that conducted the precious investigation. And that crucial question is not answered by PR speeches or angry press releases. It is answered by undeniable facts permanently placed on the record. One document at a time. 3 documents, 1 timeline, 18 seconds of silence, and 4 devastating words spoken by the director of the FBI that will now follow every single legal challenge connected to these firings. No formal determination. If you truly believe oversight matters, if you believe the rule of law absolutely depends on institutions strong enough to investigate anyone, including the powerful, then this defining moment deserves deep attention far beyond a single, short hearing clip. So watch the full exchange. Think critically about what those documents actually show, and ask yourself the difficult question at the very center of this story. Should federal investigators lose their hard-earned careers simply for carrying out a lawful investigation just because that investigation happened to touch the wrong person? If you think pivotal moments like this deserve deeper scrutiny, make sure you like this video so more people see it. Share it with someone who deeply cares about exactly how government power is used. Leave a comment below with your honest thoughts on whether you think these firings were justified. And if you want to follow every single development in the high-stakes legal challenges that are now rapidly unfolding, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications right now.